Hello, everyone. I am Sandra Malonzo, and together with Moira Ronquillo, we will discuss Immanuel Kant's Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals. We would first want to ask, if you had the power to legislate a law that should be followed by everyone in the world, what would it be? If you have answers, you may put them in the comment section or share them with the class this Friday. Now, let's hear about Kant from Moira.
Immanuel Kant is a German philosopher who was born on April 22, 1724. He is credited for synthesizing early modern rationalism and empiricism, while the fundamental idea of his philosophy revolved around the human autonomy, in which he argued that human understanding is the source of the general laws of nature, and that human reason gives itself the moral law, as we will see later. In his lifetime, he became a lecturer, a tutor, a writer, and a professor of metaphysics and logic at the University of Königsberg. Kant continued to write on philosophy and polish his ideas until shortly before his death in 1804.
To provide an overview of our reference, Kant forwards that the moral law is universal, that it's not a case-to-case basis or dependent on individual circumstances. That said, moreover forwards that there should be a metaphysics of morals to explore the a priori principles of reason. Doing so would allow people a clear understanding of moral principles and help people keep their motivations pure. In this section, we will find out why Kant wants ordinary human reason to be explored in philosophy. But let's first talk about reason. Reason is imparted to us as a practical faculty that has an influence on the will. The will is a faculty of mind that enables deliberate action. However, Kant believes that reason has weak insight and it cannot guide the will properly. Meron kasi mga individuals who use their instinct to immediately do or obtain something that makes them happy. However, people who use reason are further away from happiness or contentment because they first have to weigh the pros and cons of something before acting on it. More than just leading us to happiness, reason's true function is to produce a will that is good in itself. Goodwill is the only thing that's good without qualifications. That is, it's good for the sake of it and not its outcomes. People who have or practice goodwill are worthy of happiness. Kant believes that we have a strong inclination towards happiness. However, there are a lot of things that contribute to our happiness, making these inclinations interfere with one another. That said, we have no specific idea of what happiness really is. When we have goodwill, we abide by our duty. This refers to the specific obligations of goodwill that are considered good or considered moral. Now, the important question to ask for every action that we have is it done out of duty? But to answer this question, we first have to find out what it means for an act to be done out of duty. To help us, Kant provided three suggestions on what duty should be that in turn could help our will to be good. The main idea for the first proposition is that our duty should overcome our inclinations. Inclinations are our natural tendency to do things, but I also understood this as the reason behind our behavior. I won't be discussing in detail the other cases under this proposition, but if you want more information, they are included in our handout. Just so you know, acts that have no moral worth are those that are contrary to duty, like stealing, lying, cheating, etc. Also, acts that have no moral worth are those done in accord with duty but are done out of selfish motives or done out of immediate inclinations. The second proposition is that an action done from duty has its moral worth and the maxim according to which the action is determined. By maxim, we mean motivating principle. If you remember from our previous slides, goodwill is also good in itself, not for its outcomes, but for the sake of it alone. So this is relevant to the second proposition in a sense that no matter how good or bad the outcomes of our actions, it will only be considered moral or good if the motivating principle behind it is also good. The third proposition is that duty should be undertaken with respect for the law. So you might be wondering, bakit biglang may respect and merong law sa mga pinag-uusapan natin ngayon? According to Kant, all of us are rational beings, or humans are rational beings. Now, rational beings have will, and only the law is connected to the will, which is why we respect it. If we respect the law, we obey it. So this means that the law is the basis of the will in determining the will's plan of action. In simpler terms, the law dictates or tells the will what it should do. If you're confusing this with the meaning of reason, reason only has an influence on the will. However, yung law siya dapat yung sundan ng will. If you also notice, the three propositions are essentially saying the same things. This can be seen in the last statement, where it says that respecting the law is equivalent or similar to recognizing that the law is more important than our inclinations. Now let's have the summary of the propositions. Our will is good when we do acts of duty without considering our inclinations, without considering the outcomes of our actions, and when we do acts out of respect for the law. If you notice from our equation, we are removing the individual factor from it. This is based on Kant's next question, which is, if we remove the individual factor, what kind of law is left for the will to follow? Dito na pumapasok yung moral law na dapat universal na nabanggit sa ating introduction. Again, the moral law should not be a case-to-case basis. It should be applicable in all situations. Now, how do we apply this equation or moral law universally? Before getting into detail, I would first like to say that the question included in this slide is only my interpretation of the universal moral law. If you want the exact words, it's included in our handout. So, in the universal conformity of the will's actions to law, we should always ask ourselves, would I be content if my maxim were to become a universal law? Let's consider this example from the book. The maxim is lying because we don't want to be put at a disadvantage. Now, let's ask the question. Would I be content if my maxim were to become a universal law? The answer to the question is yes at first, because you will get to avoid that difficult situation. However, in the long run, the answer is no, because people will then see you as an untrustworthy person. And if that maxim were to become law, universal law, people will then resort to lying and no one is trustworthy anymore. We should also remember that if the answer is no, the maxim should be rejected not because of its disadvantages, but because it's not fit to be universal law. Now that we have that settled, let's try to answer why Kant thinks reason should be explored from a philosophical view, which is the main title of the first section. Siguro nagtataka kayo bakit ang dami kong diniscuss when reason lang naman yung main idea sa section. Well, based on what I understood, the principle of ordinary human reason is conformity with the law, which is connected to the universal moral law, the law itself, and goodwill, which reason has an influence on. Also, based from what I understood, may pagkabalimbing si Kant or contradictory yung mga ideas niya. Kasi on the one hand, sinabi niya na reason is relatively sound as people use it as their standard of judgment. However, if you remember from the previous slide, sinabi rin niya na reason has weak insight. And I think this is why. Because as reason wants us to ignore inclinations, it is also reason that brings them to light whenever we decide how best to act. Sinabi niya rin na the command of duty is strong, but the command of our inclinations is also strong. Kumbaga ba, minsan, ninibabaw yung influence sa atin ng inclinations kesa sa ating sense of duty. In simpler terms, from what I understood again, yung reason, may pagkarupok siya, lalo na pagdating sa mga inclinations natin. Kasi minsan, sinusundan niya yung inclinations instead of our sense of duty. So that said, the laws or the maxims, siguro, produced by reason seem to be corrupt at their very foundations because our reason itself seems to be questionable. In transitioning to the philosophical view of reason, Kant believes that we may gain information on the source of reason's own principle and its opposition to maxims based on need and inclination to escape the perplexity of opposite claims or para hindi na siya maging gaano marupok and to avoid the risk of losing all genuine moral principles. That's it for the first section. Now let's hear about the next from Moira.
Now we move on to the second section of the grounding for the metaphysics of morals, the transition from popular moral philosophy to a metaphysics of morals. This section emphasizes the importance of a reasoned approach to morality and goes beyond the bounds of the empirical and into the world of pure reason. And I quote, "In fact, there is absolutely no possibility by means of experience to make out with complete certainty a single case in which the maxim of an action that may in other respects conform to duty has rested solely on moral grounds and on the representation of one's duty." Before we start, let us define maxim. It is the subjective principle of acting, basically a person's intent. So Kant opens the second section by saying that when we pay close attention and observe the way human beings act, we find that there cannot be a cited certain example of the disposition to act from pure duty, and so has moral worth. On the other hand, Kant also mentioned how philosophers have denied and ascribed acting from duty to self-love. For example, helping others for vanity for the sake of having a good reputation or para maging popular, and thus, these philosophers speak of the frailty and impurity of human nature. And here, Kant's conceptualization of morality suggests that it is something that is not seen, because according to him, when moral value is being considered, the concern is not with the actions that are seen, but rather with the inner principles. It is neither fear nor inclination, but solely respect for the law. That is the incentive that gives an action moral worth, according to Kant, which of course cannot be seen. Second, since it is not based on empirical principles, this implies that it is a priori, based on reason, in which reason commands duty. Lastly, Kant says that morality must hold for all rational beings, or moral law must hold for all rational beings, because according to Kant, moral laws must be valid not just under contingent conditions and with exceptions, but must be absolutely necessary. So, in this reading, Kant's concept of morality focuses on duty, which is defined as the objective necessity of an action from obligation. And sabi ni Kant, when duty is pure, it exceeds empirical inducements. Kasi it loses its worth when it is mixed with extrinsic rewards, as parang yung example ko kanina, when it is influenced by popularity, wanting popularity, or a good reputation. Therefore, it is intrinsic in nature. Furthermore, Kant adds that a pure duty's influence on the human heart is much more powerful than other incentives. So, according to Kant, everything in nature works according to laws. Only a rational being has the power to act according to his conception of laws, and thereby has he a will. And when will is determined by reason, solely by reason, and independent of any other factors, extrinsic factors of any inclination, actions are recognized to be objectively necessary or practically necessary. That is, they are good. And kapag hindi naman, accorded with reason, actions recognized as objectively necessary are subjectively contingent. This brings us to the imperative, a central idea in today's discussion. So imperatives are expressed by an ought. So you ought to follow the law, you ought to obey your parents, mga ganon, indicating the relationship of an objective law of reason to a will. So Kant identified two types of imperatives. Hypothetical imperative, which represents the practical necessity of an action, that is, when it is not commanded absolutely, it would only be good as a means for some purpose. Basically, when an action is not or cannot be required of everyone, and it is only done in order to achieve some purpose, it cannot be considered good. The categorical imperative, on the other hand, represents an action as objectively necessary in itself, without reference to some other consequence or purpose. So basically, it is when an action is required of everyone and is good in itself. According to Kant, this imperative may be called that of morality. So we will focus on this, the categorical imperative. There are three principles of the categorical imperative. First is the principle of universality. According to this, the ground of all practical legislation lies objectively in the rule and in the form of universality, which makes the rule capable of being a law. Bali, its main idea suggests that we must be able to will that a maxim of our action or our intent become a universal law. So si Kant, he cited four examples in which this principle is at work. First, a person who wants to take their own life. So Kant argues that destroying life for the sake of the very same feeling that acts to further life, which is self-love, the feeling of self-love, is contradictory. Therefore, such a maxim cannot become a universal law and consequently does not accord with the principle of duty. Next example is a person who borrows money and promises to pay it back on time, pero hindi naman niya talaga kaya i-pay back that time. Pero unless nagagawin niya yun, hindi siya pahihiramin ng pera. So, nililin lang niya yung kung kanino siya naghihiram ng pera. So, Kant argues that if this were to become a universal law, promises would lose their power. Pag may nag-promise sa'yo, hindi mo napapansinin or tatawanan mo na lang because everyone would realize that every person is capable of making false promises. Third example is a person whose cultivation of talent would make it useful pero nineneglect niya ito. Kant argues, as rational beings, humans necessarily will that all their talents be developed. Thus, this cannot be possible. This cannot possibly become a universal law. And lastly, yung person na who is privileged, who finds themselves okay, but sees others struggling, says na, ano pang paki ko sa kanila, parang ganun. And Kant argues that if this were to become a universal law, kapag yung tao na to finds themselves in a situation na struggling sila and may in-need din sila, they would also be deprived of love, sympathy, and aid that they refuse to give when others were in need. Now, moving on to the second principle of the categorical imperative, we have the principle of humanity. According to this principle, the subject of all ends is every rational being as an end in themselves. Before that, let us first define what ends is. So ends are what serves the will as the objective ground of its self-determination. Kant distinguish two types. Subjective ends rest on incentives, while objective ends depend on motives, valid for every rational being. Thus, being an end to oneself, as mentioned in the previous slide, it means that people are not just subjective ends whose existence as an effect of our actions has value for us. Rather, they are objective ends which exists as ends in themselves. Basically, people are beings whose inherent value does not depend on anything else. They are valuable as themselves and on their own. Now, going back to the second principle of humanity. According to this, the subject, its main idea pala, suggests that as rational beings, humanity must always regard themselves as well as other people at the same time as an end and never simply as a means to achieve some purpose. So it applies to both ourselves and other people. So ginamit ulit ni Kant yung for examples niya to explain this principle at work. So the person who wants to take their own life, Kant argues if a person destroys themselves to escape despair, then they are making use of their person as a means to maintain a tolerable condition. When humans, sabi niya, are not things, they are not something to be used simply as means. To attain something, they must always be regarded as an end in themselves. Second, yung naghihiram, the person who borrows money, Kant argues that by making use of the one being loaned from, kung kanino siya naghihiram ng pera, the loaner is therefore making use of them merely as a means. When as rational beings, as reiterated, all people should be regarded at the same time as ends. And the third example, the one who neglected their talent, Kant argues to neglect one's talents may be consistent with the maintenance of humanity's end or their inherent worth, but it would not be consistent with the advancement of it. And lastly, yung person who is doing well but not helping others who are not doing so well, Kant argues the ends of any individual who are ends in themselves must as far as possible be another person's ends as well. So, in order for the concept of an end in itself to have its full effect on that person, parang in recognizing that other people are valuable themselves and valuable as they are, I will also come to find that I have inherent value. Okay, so lastly, the last principle of the categorical imperative, which is the principle of autonomy. According to this, The will is the supreme condition of the will's conformity with universal practical reason. Bali, its main idea suggests that the will of every rational being is a will that legislates universal law. A rational being, when they do a moral action, when they do an action that they define as moral, they must consider that they are also giving themselves this law. They are also subjecting themselves to this moral law. So, hindi lang other people, even themselves. Oh, and yun, in conceptualizing morality that is dependent on the categorical imperative, Kant recognized its limitations. According to him, we have not yet advanced far enough to prove a priori an imperative of this kind, an imperative that commands absolutely and without incentives. Nor can we prove that following this law is duty. So next, now, from this principle of autonomy, Kant yields the concept of the kingdom of ends. The kingdom of ends is defined as a systematic union, or a world of rational beings, also called mundus intelligibilis, through common objective laws. In this world, everything has either a price or a dignity. Yung price is something that can be replaced by something equivalent, such as skills with salary sa trabaho, diligence in studying in Philo with an uno, and or having being humorous and making others happy. Yung dignity naman is above all price and has therefore no equivalent, such as benevolence based on principles or fidelity to promises. So sa Kingdom of Ends, merong both um, dignity and price. In addition, in the Kingdom of Ends, a rational being regards themselves as a legislator and legislates universal laws, while also being subject to these laws themselves. Ayun. Finally, by the latter part of the second section, Kant distinguished two types of wills, the autonomy of the will as the supreme principle of morality, because it is the capacity to give the moral law to oneself. Next is heteronomy of the will as the source of all false principles of morality, because it consists of having the will determined by external forces, which implies that it is subjectively contingent and admits to only hypothetical imperatives. So, Kant ends the second section by asserting the truth of his proposition of the concept of morality, that there is no proof of it, and that it is simply an analysis. Now, going back to our opening question na tinanong ni Sandra kanina, would you still legislate or would you still answer the same thing if you know that the law that you legislate would include that you follow it too?